Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It appertains to me today to report as much as my memory and my connections with this subject will bear about two outstanding men who we might say are not only outstanding people in their own time, but really outstanding people of the age. And these are the American philosopher Manly Palmer Hall and the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Now, before engaging in some investigation of their teachings and of their lives, it may be useful for us to briefly contemplate the unusual species which we might say that they represent. The names given to such people in history are numerous, but probably the one that has stood the test of time best in any other is that they were sages. The sage is an unusual human phenomenon. It existed in every age, but was honored and revered, sometimes even worshipped in some earlier historical periods. In one of his books, Manly Palmer Hall writes that the sages, unknown to the majority of humanity, guard the wheel of time. And that somehow, this of course was very much a belief, perhaps a realization of Mr. Hall, that hidden behind all the commotion and the hullabaloo and the difficulties of human life in this world, there is a sort of secret inspiring and directing agency, which is obviously not known to most. And that this directive agency consists of the sages. Certainly, we know from history that in ancient times the sages were very greatly revered, and when we pick on some of the most outstanding ones, such as Plato, we can see that even as much as 1500 years after his life, he was revered as a superhuman being, practically never referred to in the earlier time of antiquity in any other way but the divine Plato. And it is also not known probably to most, although it's kind of a curiosity, that several assemblies of churchmen of the Catholic Church, of course, at that time, were debating whether they should make Plato a saint, who of course was a pagan and had no inkling of the coming of Christianity, but they considered him so tremendously important and so incredibly inspired that they felt that would have been appropriate, but then something always stopped the process in the end. So it is my view that in modern times, and I don't know what now, postmodern times, maybe pretty soon we have postmodern times, we also have sages, because the sage is a phenomenon of human life and of human history. Where do the sages come from? We might take a tiny little look. As far as we are able to determine, they probably come from very ancient and often prehistoric times, because their spiritual and intellectual ancestor is the shaman. So when we go back to archaic humanity, we find that there is a special class of people in every place of human habitation, in every village, which corresponds to what later on we came to call the sages. These are the wise people who receive an interior calling, or maybe have several incidents in their life when they are thus called, to separate themselves, at least for a while, from humanity, and to undergo an internal experience that turns them into archaic sages. Now, ancient people, what used to be called, maybe with a slight put on, primitive people, so let's say archaic people, have their own officials. They have their own priests, they have their own healers, hopefully they also have their cooks, and so forth. But those are the established people in the community who serve the community by way of their particular worldly training. But in addition to that, we have a few of the shamans who went out into the wild, probably when they were quite young, in response to a certain calling, and there underwent some mysterious interior process, which nowadays, talking about Carl Jung, we might probably refer to a transformation. And then they were never the same again. And their role became that of advisors and spiritual inspirers and leaders of the community. As time went on, at least in some cultures, their role changed, morphed into that of the prophet. The prophets in history are the successors of the shamans, because the prophets are prophets not because they foretell the future. That is a misapprehension and a wrongful appellation that came about later, but they know things that others don't. They hold conversations with deific beings, with inspiring and guiding agencies that other people can not perceive. And so they become the inspirers of their people. Some religious groups, particularly in the Middle East, have been correctly characterized as following prophetic religions. Probably the most prominent of these, of course, being the Jews. But so were the Persians with their great prophet Zarathustra, and so later on the Muslims with the prophet who is believed to be the seal of all prophecy, the last prophets, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on his name, as one should say. So here we have let's say, the prophetic tradition, which developed out of the roles of the shamans. As time went on, perhaps these roles were no longer the same, but still at all times, in every culture, there were sages. And we find that especially in later historical periods, these sages were recruited from different classes of society. Some, like the great Christian saints and teachers, people like Thomas Aquinas, the father of Christian theology, were monks, were clergy, monastic clergy. But others may have come from various walks of life. And so when we reach the 19th century and the early 20th century, when our two sages whom we are considered with lived, we find that indeed there were still some people who rose out of the majority of humanity and who became very, very special people, primarily in terms of their consciousness, in terms of their perceptions, in terms of their inspirations and spiritual decisions. And we are dealing with two such people today. One, the older, was born in Switzerland and became a medical doctor, although he came from a family which bore a very large number of preachers, of ministers. His grandfather, we are speaking now, of course, of Carl Gustav Jung. His grandfather, whose name Jung bore, having been probably one of the most famous Christian ministers in the history of Switzerland, the minister of the great, one of the great church in Basel, and who incidentally, now to refer a little bit to Mr. Hall's position, who also became the lifelong Grand Master of the Masonic Grand Lodge of Switzerland. This was, let us say, the lineage of one of the two sages. The other, Manly Palmer Hall, who was born in the first year of the 20th century, some 26 years after the birth of C.G.Jung, who was born in the portentous, the esoterically portentous year of 1875, was born into a family of physicians. Even his grandmother, who raised him, having been a sort of what nowadays we would call a naturopathic physician here in California. And so let's say that there was a great orientation towards toward the healing arts in certain ways in Mr. Hall's background. We also need to keep in mind, as one always should in studies that involve history, the times when these people were born, when they were raised, and then they lived. The 19th century was a peculiar period of history. Carl Jung, in his various statements, even referred to the 19th century as the true Dark Ages, unlike the early Middle Ages. The reason for that being that beginning with the exit of time from the 18th century, wherein the era of the Enlightenment, as it was referred to, had its birth and flourished, the time of, and this is a little bit important to the subject, the time of the 18th century philosophers. So as in French, since many of them were French, they were called les philosophes. Now, that was the ideal of Manly Palmer Hall. When Manly Palmer Hall founded the Philosophical Research Society, and when he came to be known more or less informally as a philosopher, or the philosopher of Los Feliz Boulevard, he meant it in the sense of the universal sort of encyclopedic inquiry of the 18th century philosophy, of people like Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot and D'Alembert, who actually, some of whom came to be called the encyclopedists. Why? Because they had set the task to themselves to write an encyclopedia, which would encompass all human knowledge. Now, how much we may admire the people of that time who were able to actually think that all the available human knowledge they could put into a few volumes of their books, which of course would be considered a totally unreasonable idea at the present time. But there's still a little connection, because as we shall look at maybe in greater detail in a few minutes, Manly Palmer Hall's great magnum opus, which is still with us, and then I understand that it is being probably republished again, God willing, was an encyclopedia. Manly Hall was an encyclopedist of the esoteric tradition. Because when Manly Palmer Hall came upon the scene and left his native Canada and spent some time in New York and eventually in California, he was confronted with an interesting but confusing psycho-spiritual situation in the United States and to some extent in Western culture. And that was the attempted revival, the attempted renewed attention, particularly in the last quarter of the 19th century, of the creative edge, the creative intellectual and spiritual edge of the culture in esoterica, in a deep tradition of the cultivation of profound interior realities, which has always been in the culture, and for that matter in the world, but which in the early part of the 19th century, until the last quarter of the 19th century, had been totally driven underground and replaced by materialism, another term for which was positivism, as the French writer Auguste Comte called it. And this orientation, I am sorry to say, bore a considerable similarity with much that passes for the intellectual and cultural life at the present time in the West. In other words, the only thing that is considered normative and real and worth pursuing is out there, is physical, is in the nature of what our otherwise man in turn came to call psychological extraversion. We live in an increasingly extraverted culture where at least one half, if not more, of the reality available to us is ignored. The part of reality I'm referring to is our interior life. and is increasingly replaced by technology and by technological devices, which in turn, once analyzed properly and insightfully, are also of an extroverted nature. If I look at the screen, as probably our friends will look at the film of this lecture, if I look at the screen, I'm looking at something external to myself, really external to myself. And moreover, so external that in a deep psychological sense, at least in my estimation, I can't really, with any degree of profundity, identify with it. That is the problem that has been so dramatically brought to our attention in the lockdown of the present epidemic. I refuse to call it a pandemic because to me Pan is a very important and charming god of antiquity, and a very healthy fellow. You know, he has horns and he has the hoofs of the goat and so forth, and he's really a fine fellow, and to connect him with sickness I think is not so good. In any event, what has come to our attention, and I'll move away from the present to the past of our two heroes in a minute, is the fact that we have learned how important it is for us to be in touch with other living, breathing, laughing, talking human beings. We can't make it without each other, and we are not going to. There is no imagery on the screen. There is no technological device that is a substitute for the human. And believe it or not, that statement, or whichever way it may be restated, is at the heart of what we have called, probably rightly so, the esoteric tradition. Because that underground stream of spirituality, which has always been in the world, and which from time to time has been brought to the surface, often against considerable opposition by the sages and their associates, is precisely based on that the individual human being and the interaction of individual human beings is of tremendous importance and cannot be replaced and substituted, replaced by anything, substituted by or anything else. Now, let's say this: in the late 19th century, as a reaction against the overwhelming materialism of the early part of the 19th century, there came about an attempted revival in a much more public manner than for a long time of the esoteric tradition. In 1875, the birth year of Carl Gustav Jung, in New York City, a group of spiritual and intellectual pioneers, inspired by a Russian world traveler and seer, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, formed the Theosophical Society, which became the alma mater, the nourishing mother, as time went on in the early 20th century and now perhaps into the 21st century, of esoteric thought that can be made available in an insightful fashion to people. So by the time Manly Palmer Hall came from Canada and was studying esoteric literature in the great libraries and museums of New York, and subsequently in various quarters in California, there has arisen a considerable confusion of esoteric or quasi-esoteric thought. Not only were there, and as there still are, thousands of Christian sects, for instance, in our culture, but there were and there are probably to this day a very large number of orientations of individuals and groups which drew their spiritual sustenance from that previously underground but always present esoteric tradition. And so Manly Hall made it his business to create an encyclopedia, just like the encyclopedist did with the secular knowledge, to create an encyclopedia which would trace in an unbiased and uncorrupted and reliable fashion the various features of the esoteric tradition. And so he wrote his magnum opus, which goes by various titles, but I think it is I always liked the subtitle, an encyclopedical outline of the Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian, is it tradition? Yeah. So he wanted to give our culture an encyclopedical outline of this unusual and yet vital field that would be reliable, that would be insightful and insight-producing, and which could be used by people to gather the kind of information about this perhaps unusual field that would be totally truthful and capable of being used. And that is why he wrote and put together with magnificent illustrations, the larger illustrations being by his artist friend J. Augustus Knapp, what we always refer to as Manly Hall's Big Book. And as he said once to us here, I think he was probably sitting right here, but anyway, in this room, he said, and then repeated it in his office, he said, since I wrote the Big Book, I have really only been writing books on paragraphs and partial chapters of that book. We considered that as having been his great contribution, and indeed such it was. And then he really devoted the rest of his life to the publicizing, to the explication, to the bringing to the attention of the insightful growing edge of the culture, of the content of that book. He put everything into it that was available to him, and when he said available, he always got that subtle charming smile that he had, which had no, it is what in French we call non pareil. There's no comparison of that smile. And you could so perhaps deduce from that smile that he gathered his information from sources that were available to others, but perhaps also from sources that were only available to himself, namely in the depths of his own vast and mysterious and yet so kindly and beautiful soul. Now, this was really the work of Manly Palmer Hall. And he spent his long life working on that task, to bring that encyclopedic knowledge of an unusual and yet extremely important field of research, endeavor, investigation to the attention of those who were capable of absorbing it, internalizing it, and hopefully turning it into a program of their life. Now I'll jump over to Switzerland, and here we had, of course, a gentleman who was already a young man when the 20th century dawned, and who came to devote himself to the medical field. Certainly the Christian ministry of his father and of his various relatives did not appeal to him. He had no less than 9 men in his family, not even very extended family, who were all ministers. How that poor boy survived that, to grow up with that many preachers, we shall never know. But he did, and he really became a spiritual giant himself, much more so than perhaps those who followed that profession. Now, we need to look for a minute at the direction, as it might be called, the intellectual - spiritual direction that C.G.Jung was involved in quite from his youth. And this had to do with what in science is referred to as empiricism. While Manly Palmer Hall was an encyclopedist, a gatherer of mysterious and wonderful information, someone who gathers that information and then puts it forth to the public in a manner that will be helpful to them, C.G.Jung was an experimenter. This is also partly the result of what came out of the 19th century milieu. Yet what he experimented with, and what some other people began to explore experientially, was very different from the materialistic experiential direction of much of the science and of the intellectuals of the age, because they came to discover that there is some kind of a mysterious life, and largely unexplored, and yet fascinating and in its way extremely important, that is inside the human being. Now, how did they come to discover that? They came to discover it by experimenting with and experiencing in their own self what in more recent decades came to be called altered states of consciousness. the unaltered consciousness in which they were indoctrinated in the schools and so forth was all externally oriented. Darwin's evolution and various scientific endeavors all outside. And yet there was training within them and within humanity an interior reality, an interior being that wanted to be recognized, that wanted to come out into the open and thereby acquire its very much needed influence in the world. Now, again, I am tempted, because that is sort of my field, to make a historical study out of this, and yet I am supposed to talk about these two people. So let's just say, as far as the historical aspect is concerned, that beginning in the late 18th century, with an Austrian doctor, Franz Anton Mesmer, and continuing at the early part of the 20th century with another Austrian doctor by the name of Sigmund Freud, an entryway was made into the interior mystery of the human being. If it hadn't been for Freud having learned and inspired and having been inspired by the hypnotic and suggestive techniques that have come to some minor prominence already around that time in the medical world, modern psychology, depth psychology as it also came to be called, psychoanalysis and analytical psychology would have never been discovered. So we don't need to go into the details, but Sigmund Freud and the various other doctors who were attracted to his approach, among whom was a broad-shouldered, strong Swiss countryman named Carl Gustav Jung. If it hadn't been for these developments, the exploration of the interior nature of the human being would have been, again, very greatly delayed. We also need to keep in mind, which is very often neglected and swept under the rug, that the early depth psychologists, the early psychoanalysts, including Freud and Jung, were also vitally interested in paranormal phenomena, in the occult, especially as it applied to the perceptive abilities and faculties of humans. They were interested in seances. They were friendly with mediums. They explored the borderline sciences of the day. And why did they do that? I have, in addition to my great interest in Jung, I had also, for professional reasons, been involved in several years of very intense study of the life and the activities and the thought of Sigmund Freud. And all of these people had developed the intuition that there was a great world, a world of continents of thought, of continents of astonishing feeling-toned experiences inside the human. And that this interior world indeed had at least as much to do with the growth and development intellectually, spiritually, if they recognize that, and perhaps even physically, of humanity as the external scientific and related disciplines which were held up so high. And so when the 20th century dawned, in the year 1900, the first great, I like to liken it to the first great bell of awakening was rung in the Western world. And it was the book on the interpretation of dreams by Dr. Sigmund Freud of Vienna, which was published right at the year 1900. And to this clarion call, let's say, about the interior mystery, they were gathered others, one of whom was Carl Gustav Jung. The difference between the two men in terms of their approach was simply being that Sigmund Freud was unable, or perhaps more unwilling than unable, to penetrate into the true depths of the human soul, of the human mind. He went as far as he could, and he was a tremendously important and devoted pioneer of human consciousness. But it was up to a younger man, younger than himself, from neighboring Switzerland, to Carl Gustav Jung, to penetrate into the greatest depths of the interior realities of humans. Now, there was a reason for that. And it was truly only revealed and has come to a fairly widespread public attention in very recent times, over the last few years, because Carl Gustav Jung himself, within his own mind and within his own soul, underwent a tremendous process of transformation, which produced his deepest insights, but which, because of its nature, could not really be openly proclaimed and revealed for a very long time, only after his own death. And what we are talking about here is that he became a medical doctor. He was what in those days in English was called an alienist, and that did not have to do with space aliens and studying of people from Mars, although some of these strange ecstatic people with whom the psychiatrist did that sort of thing. In any event, the effort was that of investigating and making a scientific study and evaluation of the human mind, of human consciousness. In so doing, C.G. Jung became what now we call a psychiatrist, and it might be of interest to note that his doctor's dissertation, which was assisted by his mentor, famous psychiatrist Dr. Breuer, that his doctor's dissertation, which is volume 1 of Jung's collected writings at this time, was on the psychology and pathology of the so-called occult phenomena. That is how Carl Jung became a medical doctor. That was the subject that he wrote about. Now, that tells you something right there. And of course, he did his own experimentation. Some of it was he had a young cousin on his mother's side, a young girl who was psychic, was mediumistic, and Carl Jung with some of his friends held seances and rather curious, interesting information, things like that came forth. But in any event, you can see that his interest in the deepest interiority, let us say, of the human psyche, as they called it professionally, which is of course just Greek for soul, had led him to the paranormal, to the unusual, to the extraordinary at a very early time in his career. And then as time went on, only a few years, by then he had married, had a family, and so forth, he came to a crisis in his own consciousness, as in his own life. And the crisis was that he felt that owing to the necessity of his profession, he had to concentrate so much on the externality, on the physicality of the human mind, that in so doing and in engaging in this work and obtaining that orientation, he had, as he came to call it, lost his own soul. And this, of course, when you come to a recognition of that sort, that is a great crisis in your life. And then with the assistance of some others who were able to help him a little bit in this regard, he began a fantastic internal journey. This occurred right around the time and subsequent to World War I. The first experiences, I think, were about 1913, and it went into the 1920s. In this interior exploration, which was full of visions, full of insightful inspirations and communications of a monumental kind, he came to recognitions which henceforth formed his psychology. And Carl Gustav Jung came to recognize at that early period of his career that his appointed task in this life was not primarily, or certainly not exclusively, to become what in colloquial language around here we used to call a shrink, and a tinkerer with the human mind, but rather that he had to become an explorer of the greatest profundities of existence, and moreover that these greatest profundities had a door of access. One could enter them through the human psyche. That was the way in which he would penetrate reality ever deeper and deeper. Of course, the precise nature of these activities of his and the various details attendant thereto did not come to the light of day until long after his death, only within the last few years, when his record, which was sort of as Manly Hall had one book, which was his encyclopedia of the mysterious reality. And C.G.Jung wrote a book, which was his account of the mysterious reality as he entered it and as he experienced it. But while Mr. Hall was able to have his book published just as soon as it was written, and so forth, and really made that encyclopedic knowledge available, and then he became its interpreter and advocate for many, many years. Jung was not able to publish his book. Why? Because he was practical enough to realize that if he published this book, he would be then ignored as just another visionary, just another medium, just one of these people who live in their weird imagination and whose insights and whose teachings are usually not worth a great deal. And so even though he wrote this beautiful manuscript in a very medieval-like script and illustrated it with his own paintings and drawings, he only communicated its content in his lifetime to a very few people, but it was there, and he knew with his deep intuition that the time would come when this source material of his wisdom would be made available to the public and would produce some important results therein. And so now we have available that particular book, the Red Book, as well as certain ancillary material of several smaller volumes, which has even more recently, in fact, in the terrible year of 2020, the Annus Horribilis, as I like to call it in Latin, in that year came to be published what are called the Black Books, which are additional material of that sort. Now, in a certain sense, well, of course, none of these activities are easy, and I'm sure, and I certainly have gathered from some of his remarks that Mr. Hall's life and work was not easy. He had grave strokes of fate that visited him from time to time. He was determined to go on with making the tradition which goes back to the foundations of the human race and which deals with that part of ourselves and with that part of reality that justly can be called transcendental, that which transcends. What does transcendental transcend? I'm sure Mr. Hall wouldn't mind if I tried to recount it. It first of all transcends the physical. That's fairly easy to recognize, perhaps. Secondly, it transcends the emotional, the feeling nature. And then it transcends, oh horror of horrors, it transcends the thinking mind, even. Not that it does away with any of these things. I had the good fortune in Mr. Hall himself and in various other people in the Theosophical Society and so forth, of meeting quite a few people who were intensely intuitive and visionary and so forth. And you know, they were all very sane. They were practical people while they were also involved in these greater worlds. But let us say, by transcending the thinking function, by not being caught as all of us are, much of the time, most of the time, and it's probably the greatest of I have come to think that it's the greatest affliction of the human race. I only came to that conclusion during the lockdown. You can imagine why. That we are so much governed, our lives are so heavily and constantly influenced by our thinking that we can't break out of it. Our thinking function is a terrible cage from which to exit takes an awful lot of work. Yet, C.G.Jung came to find that. And he found it by way of just working, very assiduously working on his own inner life, finding various symbolic modalities therein whereby to come to a greater reality. If you just have a little bit of an insight into the Red Book, you can see what this involved. And so Jung underwent from 1913 on to the middle 1920s, he underwent a tremendous interior transformation. He wasn't the same man that he was before. He was in intimate contact with the deepest regions of his own psyche, of his own soul, and by way of this interior exploration, he became privy to the world, to the insights, to the disclosures of those higher faculties which are beyond the thinking principle, the intuitive, and beyond the intuitive to certain spiritual faculties, which he came to call the transcendent function. But he still had one great problem, and that was how to. This is a problem that Mr. Hall didn't have. Just like Mr. Hall was able to publish his Red Book, his big book. I don't think it was ever read, and Jung couldn't. And that was that he was trying to bring the insights gained in these years of interior visionary experiences. C.G. Jung was trying to make them useful to humanity, how to bring these insights out so that they would be able to help other people to undergo a transformation similar to the one that he did. And this was very, very difficult for a variety of reasons. But something came to his aid, and this is, of course, what Jung came to teach, among other things, that when the pressure rising from within, when the living stream of the soul really begins to flow and thunder over the countryside, then it will gather unto itself helpful information, helpful devices, which will facilitate the bringing forth of the difficult interior insight. And that is how Jung came to discover alchemy. Interestingly enough, he discovered it, or let's say he became vitally interested in it. Mon Dieu, became vitally interested in it by way of a ancient Chinese alchemical treatise, which was brought to him by his friend Richard Wilhelm, the great Chinese scholar from China, and which was the translation and commentary of which was subsequently written by Wilhelm and by Jung as The Secret of the Golden Flower. And while the details of the alchemical symbolism of Taoist China are different from that of medieval Europe, there is enough similarity between the two that Jung recognized that there is a process of transformation which he underwent in his own Red Book experiences, let us say, but of which the greatest symbolic exposition ever made in literary form is the literature of alchemy of medieval Europe. And interestingly enough, around the same time, Manly Palmer Hall, who was to Mr. Hall, being an encyclopedist, Mr. Hall was a collector. You know, every summer when he went on, he and Mrs. Hall, usually in the company of some friends of theirs, went to the Orient, usually to Japan. Then after he came home and was here in a couple of 2-3 weeks later, the big crates, wooden crates, came from Japan. And there were all the beautiful things that he collected in Japan. Most of it sold to him by the semi-mythical antiquities dealer about whom he wrote a little book, Mr. Nakamura. A lovely little book. So Mr. Hall was a collector. He collected stamps also. He was one of the very few people who had Tibetan stamps issued by the Dalai Lama. Beautiful ones. What would you expect? You know. In any event, he came to collect alchemical literature. And so we had this magnificent collection of alchemical works. And this was, I think, the principal contact that they ever had. During the war, when, of course, everything was difficult to procure, difficult to send, and so forth, Mr. Hall was contacted by, who do you think? Carl Gustav Jung. And I did not see the nature of the communication, but he told us about it. And he said that basically Jung said, I understand, Mr. Manly Hall, that you have a very fine alchemical collection. I am writing books on alchemy. Would it be possible for you, at my request, and within the limits of what I desire, to send me copies of certain portions of your alchemical collection? And Jung said, I would be immensely grateful. You know how much limited we are by the war to do anything, but this is extremely important. And so, in those days, that was long before Xerox and things of that sort, but photostatic copies of the requested requested pages from the requested books of Manly Hall's alchemical collection were sent to Switzerland and became part of the corpus of alchemical writings that C.G.Jung wrote about. Now, C.G.Jung discovered, largely on the basis of the insights that came to him in the Chinese example, that the alchemist's inner endeavor, the true ultimate endeavor of the alchemist, was certainly not making gold, or even the philosopher's stone which would make gold, because that is really how it works, but rather that the important issue was the transformation of the alchemist himself, as indeed stated by some of the great alchemists, but usually in a very very low-key and very subdued fashion. Yet we find such statements as that, I think, by Gerhardus Dor, who said, "Therefore be ye living philosopher's stones." Once you have the key and you see that it's the alchemist who is being transformed, then some of these sentences jump out at you. And as far as Mr. Hall's own interpretation of alchemy was concerned, I only got that much out of him myself. Others may have been able to squeeze him a little bit more. He said, alchemy was the most important discipline of our culture for at least 3,000 or 4,000 years, because he saw the origins of alchemy as going back to Egypt and places like that. So there was the one great doorway that Jung found, whereby to put forth the insights, the principles, and the nature of the process of the transformation of the human soul, of the human psyche, which was given to him in his Red Book experiences, as we call them, to the general public. And therefore he wrote one book on alchemy after the other. I think the first one having been Psychology and Alchemy, but then a whole number of others. And I heard people at the university in Innsbruck, which I will conclude with my on a little personal note in a minute, wherein people said, well, here is, this very unusual great psychologist. He's the greatest of the living psychologists just over the mountains in Switzerland, but he keeps writing about alchemy. What is that all about? People couldn't figure it out. But of course, as time went on, at least some people in the Jungian fold came to recognize that the alchemy was the symbolic statement, the symbolic account of the transformation of the human soul, which is indeed the underlying intentionality, the intentional endeavor of the human psyche. And this is, of course, also something that Jung emphasized very greatly. Our being, our nature wants to be transformed desperately, anxiously. It doesn't want to stay the way it is. See, some of the people earlier in the 19th century projected the evolutionary paradigm onto this, that we want to evolve. But Jung said, no, we don't want to evolve, we want to transform. And this transformation has certain rules and certain patterns, certain individual chapters of its own, which the alchemists discovered way back in they already came out with it in Alexandria and Egypt, but Mr. Hall was strongly inclined to believe that which is a logical conclusion, that its origins went back actually into ancient Egypt, into pharaonic Egypt, and since then has been the great symbol of the process of this desperate endeavor that is inside of each and every one of us, that is trying to turn our soul, turn our mind into a mystery, a mysterious, powerful, tremendously insightful and deific being, the philosopher's stone. That we can become the stone of the philosophers, and then by way of our insight and our endeavors, we can help the transformation, the spiritualization, the insight of other people. This, as Jung said, this is the true calling of the human, to transform and then to help others to transform. Because surely the way we are, things are not right. Things are not right. We are lacking in insight, we are lacking in wisdom, we are lacking in goodness, we are prey to all kinds of terrible complexes and terrible difficulties. Only a transformation will make us whole. What we strive for is wholeness. And the Latin word for which Jung fished out of the dictionary was individuation. We want to become an individuum, an indivisible spiritual entity. And that is really what we are here for. Not to be members of society, not to be members of political parties and fight with each other and revile each other in that fashion, or any of the others. Not here to make money, not here to accumulate degrees in universities, but we are here to become whole. And that wholeness was not only foreshadowed, but very much clearly stated in alchemy. And so he was able for a number of years, under the alchemical glyph, the alchemical symbol, to put forth the principles which, of course, he also embodied in his psychological books. Yet the alchemical opus of C.G.Jung is the key to his psychological works. You will never relate in depth to his psychology unless you have had some understanding of alchemy. And I dare say, to the credit of Mr. Hall, that Mr. Hall's fine alchemical collection reposes, I hope it's still there, at the Getty Museum, for after his life it was arranged that the Getty Museum could purchase it. Now, a couple of minutes and we'll be done. Why? I think there is nothing like experience to enliven, to inspire, and to enlighten. And I must indicate here, without bragging, but just reminiscing as appertains to aged persons, my connections with these two. Now everybody, not everybody, I mean, probably the people who will see this film will know that, of course, beginning in 1970, after having come to his lectures and come here to the library and things for many years, I became associated with Mr. Hall, and I was for quite a while the only, or almost the only, lecturer beside Mr. Hall here. So that became my connection. After having heard a lecture by him in the small auditorium upstairs, that almost knocked me to the ground. I have never heard anybody speak like Manly Hall. The most incredible oratory of wisdom that I have ever encountered. So that is that was that particular chapter. I have never met Carl Gustav Jung. I was not a psychologist, that was not my field. But I started reading him and studying him and developing a relationship, let us say, to the Jungian corpus while I was a student in Austria at the University of Innsbruck. And since the Tyrol, the province of Austria, there is very close to Switzerland, and there were possibilities of doing that, especially for students in those days. We used to sneak across the border from Austria to other countries, to Italy primarily in order to drink wine. Very cheap and very good. To Switzerland, maybe for other reasons. And so one time I snuck across the border to Switzerland. Well, snuck across. I had to be cleared by the border guard, and the border guard said to me in his strange Swiss German, "If you don't come back by 8 o'clock tonight and cross this border, I will still, if you don't come back, better watch out because I'm going to catch you." I said, "Mein Herr, I'll be there." I'll get back. So I got over to Zurich, and I was outside of the Jung Institute, and some program had just ended, and people were coming out, and among them was a somewhat bent over already, white-haired gentleman who was surrounded by, you guessed it, beautiful ladies. Jung was always accompanied by a number of very outstanding women in many respects, who then of course wrote books themselves. And so the fellow who was with me pointed, "Well, that is Dr. Jung over there." So I did see him walking slowly away from the Jung Institute. But let us say I certainly agreed with another wise man whom I had some contact with when talking about Jung. He said, and who knew Jung, I said that there is there is so much more to Dr. Jung than people recognize. Or another Theosophical and Jungian friend of mine, the late Dr. Lawrence Bendit, who when he first saw Jung at a psychological meeting in England said, "This one is entirely different than all the others." All the Freudians and all the minor Jungians who came to England to lecture said, "This one is really different. There is something about this man that none of the others had." And even at a distance you could feel that. And so at the as let us say I am now the age that Mr. Hall was when he passed away, you know, and that kind of gives me thought now and then. But let us say I am profoundly grateful. I will be grateful even if my consciousness can do it into the other life, that I had encountered these two, one of them more intimately and personally in his own work, and the other by way of what he did and by the way of the people who were associated with. Because I can say that I lived in an age when, in spite of world wars and revolutions and concentration camps and all these sort of things, there were two sages in this world. Two real sages whose wisdom has already been of very great import to the human race, and which will continue to be such, and whose contribution to the soul of humanity has been the greatest treasure that has come that way for many a century. And I am humbled and grateful to have lived in their time and to have been able to avail myself of some of their wisdom, of some of their insight, of some of the great gift, the great alchemical gold the great philosopher's stone that they have brought to us, and for which we shall remain eternally grateful in this life and in the next, and forever and ever. And I thank you very much.